Hi, I'm Dr. Richard Caputo, Professor Emeritus of Social Policy and Research, Yeshiva University in New York City. I have taught graduate-level social welfare policy and policy analysis courses for over 30 years. This course comprises 5 lectures, upon completion of which you will understand how public assistance for primarily low-income mothers with little or no formal labor force attachment transitioned from a federally entitled, state-administered cash assistance income maintenance program known as Aid to Families with Dependent Children by way of job readiness demonstration waiver projects to a financially federally capped, time-limited labor force participation program. You will learn about rationales behind benchmarks in the transition, the Social Security Act of 1935, the 1964 War on Poverty declared by the Johnson administration, lessons learned from the failed attempt to nationalize the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program during the Nixon administration of the 1970s, the creation of the Earned Income Tax Credit in 1975 that would blossom into one of the largest cash assistance programs in the United States, and thereby set the stage for the eventual elimination of non-work-related cash assistance for mothers with young children. The siege of the welfare state throughout the Reagan administration of the 1980s and the Family Support Act of 1988. The influence of the Contract with America, proposed by House Republicans in 1994. The Welfare Reform Act of 1996, that in effect ended welfare as the nation had come to know it since 1935, though in ways that neither President Clinton nor his domestic policy advisors had expected. In addition, you will learn how the COVID-19 pandemic, brought to national attention in 2020 and 2021, two never-adopted policies benefiting low-income individuals and families to date, namely family allowances and basic income guarantee. There are 2 broad goals of the course. The main objective of the course is to identify key factors and forces that shape the transition from Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, AFDC, to the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, TANF, T-A-N-F. Another objective of the course is to highlight policy challenges and options ahead. If you are interested in understanding what, why, and how the main open-ended federal-state shared cash assistance income maintenance program morphed into a time-limited, financially federally capped labor force attachment participation program, and to think out of the box regarding policy options benefiting low-income families with young children, this is the course for you. Looking forward. This lecture presents a historical overview of social welfare programs aimed at improving the economic well-being of low-income families in the United States prior to the Reagan administration of the 1980s. It focuses primarily on the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, AFDC, which was enacted in 1935 and underwent several modifications and reforms before its replacement by the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, TANF, in 1996. Background historical markers include the Social Security Act of 1935, which again created AFDC, and 2, the Johnson administration's War on Poverty and the related Social Security amendments of the 1960s. Also noted are failed attempts to nationalize AFDC by linking cash assistance to work, specifically the Nixon administration's proposed Family Assistance Plan, FAP, FAP, which aimed to provide a basic income to low-income working families. Given FAP's failure in 1970 and again in 1972, this lecture also introduces the Earned Income Tax Credit, EITC, enacted in 1975, and one of the largest public assistance programs since the 1990s, thereby abetting political tractability to replace AFDC with TANF. I begin with the Social Security Act of 1935 and related amendments through the early 1960s. Approval of the Social Security Act, SSA, on August 14, 1935, launched the U.S. welfare state. In effect, the Social Security Act established two approaches to relieving economic want. One, contributory social insurance, in which entitlement to benefits is based on an earned right linked to past work-related income contributions. And two, public assistance, that is distributed after a state's determination of economic need or means tested. Public assistance was designed for those who had no viable connection to the labor market, the aged, blind, dependent children. Public assistance was a legal entitlement in that the federal government promised to provide such matching funds as might be required for states to pay for benefits to all persons eligible under the existing law. By the end of World War II, elderly persons were the primary recipients of public assistance in the U.S. Increased eligibility of elderly persons for old age insurance led to a decline in such recipients for old age assistance. ADC recipients began shifting from widowed families to those of unmarried mothers, precipitating a backlash to restrict eligibility of recipients during the 1950s and the 1960s. The Kennedy administration's public welfare amendments of 1962 was the first major welfare reform effort prior to the Johnson administration's declaration of the War on Poverty in 1964. The 1962 amendments permitted states to use federal aid to maintain community work and training projects for unemployed people receiving welfare payments, with the understanding in Congress that the work for relief for able-bodied persons would be at the prevailing wage, not compete with private industry, and not involve public work programs by welfare departments. These demonstration projects were the first waivers allowing states to test new ideas in welfare policy. In 1964, the War on Poverty elevated poverty to the national concern. Paradoxically, however, the War on Poverty rested on principles and mandated programs that in effect excluded many poor persons, especially women and with young children, the main recipients of the AFDC program. Although the overall poverty rates declined, the number of AFDC recipients and the percentage of children in poverty increased. In 1960, 22.2% of the population lived in poverty. At the start of the War on Poverty in 1964, about 19% of the population did. The proportion of the population in poverty steadily declined throughout the remainder of the decade, so that by 1971, 12.5% of the population lived in poverty. The average number of monthly recipients of AFDC in 1960 was roughly 3 million, up from about 1 million in 1940 and 2 million in 1950. By 1970, the AFDC clientele increased to 8.5 million and to over 10 million in 1971. At any given time between 1960 and 1971, children comprised about 75% of total recipients. The proportion of children living in poor female-headed households nearly doubled from 23.7% in 1960 to 46.9% in 1971, a 97.9% change, outpacing the change in the proportion of children in all female-headed households, 9.2% in 1960 to 13.3% in 1971, a 44.5% change. By 1967, as far as Congress was concerned, public assistance services were to be concrete and work-related. Personal competence, an aim of the 1962 amendments, morphed into skills competence, which was to lead more directly to work. The major vehicle for implementing AFDC-related work and training created by the Social Security 1967 amendments was the Work Incentive Program, known as WIN, W-I-N. WIN was the first major federal work program for AFDC, and it remained the only work requirement program until October 1990, when provisions of the Family Support Act of 1988 went into effect. WIN had a spotty history, and by the end of the 1960s, the National Welfare Rights Organization, which helped mobilize women, called on Congress to end the program. Through 1971, 2.1 million assessments were made, of which only 24% were deemed appropriate for referral. From this pool, only 118,000 were enrolled in WIN, and of those leaving the program, only 20% held a job for at least 3 months. I now turn to the second set of historical markers highlighting attempts to nationalize public assistance and linking receipt of such assistance to work. I first examined several forms of guaranteed annual income, GAI, schemes that set the backdrop for a discussion of the Nixon administration's Family Assistance Plan, FAP, a failed, though instructive attempt to nationalize public assistance. I then note adoption of the Earned Income Tax Credit Program, EITC, initially designed to encourage low-wage workers with children to remain attached to the labor force. The 1960s entertained the notion of a guaranteed annual income, most prominently in the U.S. in the form of the negative income tax, NIT, proposals, and related experiments, and a second category known as social dividend plans. Although mentioned briefly earlier in the 20th century, the idea of guaranteed income in general and the NIT generated little political traction until the 1960s, when economists Milton Friedman recommended and Robert Lampman advocated for the NIT as a means of alleviating poverty. Some 1,300 economists and approximately 150 institutions signed a petition to Congress in 1968 urging adoption of a national system of income guarantees and supplements. The President's Commission on Income Maintenance Programs recommended adoption of NIT in its 1969 final report. Family allowances, payments based on the number of children in a family regardless of income, competed with the NIT as a form of guaranteed income. Both types of guaranteed income schemes, the NIT favored by economists and family allowances favored by social workers and sociologists, were discussed by the Johnson administration, though neither was adopted. Several NIT experiments were launched in the 1960s and early 1970s, the most prominent among them being the New Jersey-Pennsylvania negative income tax experiment and the Seattle-Denver income maintenance experiment, the SIME-DIME, which related experiments also in Gary, Indiana. These experiments per se, however, had little impact on the welfare reform efforts of the Nixon administration, again known as the Family Assistance Plan, proposed in 1969 and again in 1972. Their results were published primarily in various issues of the Journal of Human Resources throughout the 1970s, and most extensively with the SIME-DIME results in the autumn 1980 issue. The NIT experiment's impact was highly influential in welfare reform debates during the Carter administration at the end of the 1970s and the Reagan administration throughout the 1980s, culminating in 1988 with the passage of the Family Support Act discussed momentarily. Suffice it to say here, however, that in addition to costs, two main driving concerns of political feasibility and social acceptability during the Nixon and Carter administrations were the effects of such programs on work effort and marital stability. In its most generous form, the Nixon administration's Family Assistance Plan would have increased to $2,400, the minimum income for a family of four with no earnings. 3.6 million persons in 11 southern states and 3.4 million in other states, barred from any cash assistance, would have become eligible for assistance, nearly doubling the number of those receiving public assistance under the AFDC program. AFDC recipients in 15 southern states would have seen an increase in the economic standing since maximum welfare benefits fell below $2,400 a year. The prospect of improving the economic standing of poor blacks in southern states presented a formidable challenge to the political hegemony of congressional Southern Democrats, as well as governors who, for the most part, opposed FAP, Jimmy Carter of Georgia being a main exception, and to the Southern economy, which relied on a pool of low-income black labor. By equalizing earnings at the bottom of the wage scale between men and women, and between whites and blacks, the Family Assistance Plan would have enabled Southern black men and women from the necessity of accepting the lowest wage work. AFDC would be abolished, the dual goals of poverty reduction and income maintenance abandoned. FAP was work-related. Recipients would have had to accept training opportunities and suitable work when available. Refusal to participate in work requirements would result in loss of his position or of the benefit. By the advent of the Nixon administration, however, poverty per se was no longer viewed as a social problem to be addressed. This is not to say that poverty had been eliminated. The 13 million working poor who were to benefit from FAP, had it passed, were ongoing testimony to that. Attention shifted to welfare caseloads, which, as noted earlier, increased over the 1960s and 1970s, and the composition shifted disproportionately to unwed black mothers. Hence, AFDC recipients lost some moral standing and were subject to two stigmatizing characteristics, namely race and marital status. This was due to the disproportionate numbers of unwed black mothers, to which a third stigmatizing characteristic was added: no labor force attachment. Non-working, able-bodied persons were viewed as undeserving of cash assistance, unless it was tied to work-related efforts, such as working in a public work program or job training, which became known as workfare. The treatment of employable persons on the same moral basis as unemployable persons made little sense unless the former passed a work test. That is, were willing to look for and accept employment as a condition of receiving benefits. With vilification of the welfare system in general and the AFDC program by President Nixon and others, the much debated conundrum among policymakers and political pundits was whether the enjoyment of both the non-working and the working poor into one overarching or comprehensive program like the Family Assistance Plan would, in effect, result in an expansion of the AFDC program. It was estimated that FAP would add about 13 million persons to the welfare rolls. FAP, in effect, would collapse the distinction between deserving and undeserving poor that historically played an important role in the development of social policy in the U.S. A combination of cultural, institutional, and pragmatic factors eroded its initial support for FAP and accounted for its demise, first in 1970 and again in 1972. Collapsing AFDC poor and working poor persons and the cultural factor challenging the work ethic that many on the political right of the political spectrum found unacceptable could not be reconciled with the pragmatic factor of trying to contain the fiscal burden of welfare, which was particularly acute for many state and city governments. In 1971, California Governor Ronald Reagan, an opponent of FAP, began experimenting with workfare programs, that is, requiring that AFDC recipients work in return for benefits. At their peak in 1974, workfare programs had about 5,700 participants, less than 1% of California's AFDC cases that year. Overall, political conservatives contended there was a moral hazard issue associated with the potential erosion of the work ethic among the working poor and potential discouragement of non-working AFDC poor from seeking work. Political liberals and other more strident activists on the left side of the political spectrum also opposed FAP. The National Welfare Rights Organization, whose constituency included mostly AFDC recipients, contended that work requirements in FAP, which was initially silent regarding a minimum wage requirement, thereby arousing opposition from unionized labor, amounted to slave labor, and that the level of cash benefit was simply too low. From the vantage point of organized labor, the AFL-CIO increased numbers of non-working but employable AFDC recipients would add to the pool of low-income workers, thereby intensifying competition for a fixed number of jobs and exacerbating low-wage employment. I now turn to one additional benchmark, the Earned Income Tax Credit. This lecture examines changes in public assistance throughout the 1980s. I cover 5 major topics. 1. Theoretical and empirical underpinnings of the ideological attacks on the welfare state advanced by social scientists and political pundits, for whom the aid to families with dependent children, the AFDC program, had come to represent the limits of government beneficence. 2. Key aspects of the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1981 that opened the way for welfare and work-related demonstration projects. 3. The emergence of congressional consensus linking welfare to work. 4. Passage and provisions of the Family Support Act of 1988, which cemented the link between welfare and work. And 5. Critiques of the Family Support Act of 1988, setting the stage for replacing AFDC with the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, TANF, program during the Clinton administration, the subject of our next lecture. I begin with the siege of the welfare state. The election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 signified a growing disillusion about the role of government in the economy and society, and a more sustained challenge to the income maintenance function of the U.S. welfare state. The stagflation of the 1970s called into question the viability of the U.S. welfare state as it weakened the faith of policymakers both in the achievement of full employment and in the Keynesian demand management which had guided public strategies since the 1940s. Regarding poverty, the Reagan election provided a political wedge for anti-welfare punditry about the values and behaviors of poor persons, particularly unmarried mothers, and non-custodial fathers who failed to pay child support. Anti-welfare scholars such as Charles Murray and Lawrence Mead argued respectively that public assistance for able-bodied non-working persons was a moral hazard, encouraging sloth and illegitimacy, and that to the extent AFDC was to be retained, it should have stronger work requirements. Promoting the idea of a work ethic state, the journalist and pundit Mickey Kaus proposed that all single mothers should work all the time to provide for their families. Although he took issue with Kaus about the reasonableness of such pro-work proposals, even the sympathetic welfare supporter economist David Ellwood, who would serve on President Bill Clinton's welfare task force in 1993 to 1995, sought to return AFDC into a transitional support program designed to promote short-term financial, educational, and social support, so that AFDC would be more like a stepping stone into the labor market. President Reagan starkly characterized the anti-welfare government is the problem approach to welfare reform in his February 15, 1986 radio address to the nation. We're in danger of creating a permanent culture of poverty, as inescapable as any chain or bond. A second and separate America, as America of lost dreams and stunted lives. The irony is that misguided welfare programs instituted in the name of compassion have actually helped turn a shrinking problem into a national tragedy. From the 1950s on, poverty in America was declining. American society, and opportunity society, was doing its wonders. Economic growth was providing a ladder for millions to climb out of poverty and into prosperity. In 1964, Reagan went on, the famous war on poverty was declared, and a funny thing happened. Poverty, as measured by dependency, stopped shrinking and then actually began to grow worse. I guess you could say, Reagan concluded, poverty won the war. Passage of the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1981, OBRA, signaled the shift from income maintenance function of welfare to labor market readiness and participation. OBRA permitted states to convert the work incentive, WIN program, into a block grant administered by welfare agencies, and to use workfare as a component of state programs. Although 40 states participated, with much within and between state variation, two notable contrasting innovative programs were one, ET, the Employment and Training Program in Massachusetts, and two, GAIN, G-A-I-N, the Greater Avenues for Independence program in California. These programs provided different solutions to the moral ambiguity of welfare and work. With voluntary participation, ET reduced the ambiguity, whereas with its carrot and stick approach, GAIN heightened it. The Employment and Training Program, ET, in Massachusetts, symbolically departed from WIN by viewing AFDC recipients as potential customers to be attracted in part through an active marketing campaign and with higher levels of committed resources for support services, such as child and health care. State appropriations went from about $200,000 for WIN in 1980 to about $18 million for ET in 1985 to $68 million in 1988. Employment and training participation rates were unusually high, with 67% of all adults on AFDC participating in 1987, 44% of those obtaining jobs with a mean starting wage of about $5.70 per hour, and 49% of those who found jobs staying off welfare. Critics of ET, however, accused ET of creaming, that is, of selecting the most motivated and job-ready recipients. GAIN, in Massachusetts, required all eligible AFDC recipients to participate in the program until they were employed or off AFDC. Registration was mandatory for all AFDC unemployed parent recipients and for AFDC recipients whose youngest children were 3 years old or older. GAIN operated with a complex logic that entailed a progression from basic education to job search, and for those failing to obtain employment, to further assessment, vocational training, and possibly work experience. All too often, however, eventually interrupted welfare spells precluded such an orderly progression. With 60% of recipients barely literate, GAIN became a massive educational program rather than a jobs program. Its uneven implementation throughout the state complicated any assessments for effectiveness, although its ability to provide services in large counties, such as Los Angeles, was limited to 10% of eligible GAIN participants. The absence of any control groups made it impossible to assess effectiveness for either EITC or for GAIN. Nonetheless, GAIN, with its mandatory work requirements rather than ET with its voluntary participation, served as the role model for welfare reform efforts culminating in the Family Support Act of 1988, and again in the far more comprehensive Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, the subject of the next lecture. In the 99th and 100th sessions of Congress in 1986 and 1987, respectively, a consensus emerged linking welfare reform to work that had eluded the Nixon and Carter administrations, thereby paving the way for the Family Support Act of 1988, signed by President Reagan on August 13th. Part of what drove that consensus was public and scholarly preoccupations with and debates about the status of the American family in general, particularly about increasing numbers of divorces, of never-married single-headed households with children, and of older first-time marriages. The welfare consensus encompassed 3 main points. First, family breakdown and inadequate inner-city educational systems were generating a permanently dependent underclass whose nature and extent received popular as well as scholarly attention throughout the 1980s and early 1990s. Second, reform should be based on reciprocal responsibilities between government and welfare recipients. Third, states should be given greater discretion over certain aspects of welfare policy. While reaffirming the income maintenance function of social welfare provisioning in general and retaining the entitlement nature of the AFDC program, the Family Support Act of 1988 placed a premium on employment with little regard to adequacy of income. FSA, the Family Support Act, also ignored the plight of millions of working poor persons, unlike the Nixon administration's Family Assistance Plan and the Carter administration's Program for Better Jobs and Income. The emphasis advocated by political economist David Elward was, to the extent reasonably possible, to convert AFDC from a payment program with a supplementary jobs component into a jobs program with supplemental components, such as childcare, support, child allowances, and an expanded earned income tax credit, with higher levels and more gradual phase-out amounts for each additional child beyond the allotted 2. The Family Support Act of 1988 had 6 titles or provisions. Title I addressed child support and establishing paternity. It required immediate wage withholding for all new child support orders, issued on or after January 1st, 1994. It also required withholding of child support payments from non-custodial parents' wages upon issuance or modification of a child support order for families receiving services under Part D of Title VII of the Social Security Act. Parties in contested paternity had to submit to genetic tests upon the request of a party in such cases. States that did not have automated data processing and information retrieval systems in effect had to have such systems operational by October 1, 1995. Title II, the centerpiece of the Family Support Act, required all states to implement workfare programs, that is, to establish fully operational job opportunities and basic skills training programs known as JOBS, J-O-B-S, or Welfare to Work initiatives by October 1992. All mothers whose youngest children were 3 years or older, about 40% of all AFDC mothers, were required to participate in the JOBS program. Title II authorized states to institute a work supplementation program under which state cash payments that would otherwise go to job participants as AFDC benefits would be used instead to subsidize jobs for such participation. Title II was predicated on the assumption that job training programs were adequate to the task and that the job market would absorb persons who were successfully trained and sufficiently educated. Title III of FSA directed states to guarantee child care services to AFDC families to the extent such services were necessary for a family member's employment or participation in an education and training activity which had state approval. States were required to continue a family's Medicaid eligibility for 6 months if the family lost AFDC eligibility under specified circumstances. Title III also required states with unemployment parents programs to continue to operate them without a time limitation. Title IV retained the employment aspects of AFDC. That is, it required states to provide AFDC benefits to every family which meets AFDC need standards and whose children are deprived. Title IV retained the entitlement aspects of AFDC. That is, it required states to provide AFDC benefits to every family which meets AFDC need standards and whose children are deprived of paternal support due to unemployment of its principal partner or earner. Title V made demonstration project funds available to assess the impact of jobs participation on reducing school dropouts, encouraging skill development, and avoiding sole reliance on AFDC payments, among other things. She noted the absence of a national minimum benefit, which thereby enabled states to continue setting AFDC benefit levels whose real values had dropped by 31% between 1970 and 1985. In 1988, the maximum combined AFDC and food stamp benefits failed to bring a family of 3 in any state up to the federal poverty line. And in 39 states, these benefits failed to reach 75% of poverty thresholds. In addition, the employment provisions were less than satisfactory. Rather than mandating states to provide education, training, and job placement programs as initially proposed, such services were optional. States were only required to provide the least costly job search, basic education, and workfare programs, rather than the more extensive skill-building education and training services. Abramowitz further contended that FSA hurt rather than helped poor adults and their families. Declining standards of living were forcing increased numbers of middle-class women and mothers with young children into the labor market. Furthermore, welfare mothers were more likely to fill part-time jobs and earn less than the $7,000 annual minimum wage. They were a potential source of cheap labor whose prospective wages would be insufficient to enable women to avoid abusive marriages or insecure jobs. The ranks of the working poor had increased by 50% between 1978 and 1985, and FSA would only add to that. Abramowitz also rebuked public and professional opinion about welfare dependency. Most daughters of welfare mothers did not end up on welfare, and most welfare mothers left welfare roles within 2 years. She recoiled against the transformation of AFDC into an employment program based on a contractual arrangement. A contract between parties as unequal as a welfare mother and the state, Abramowitz contended, effectively weakens the protections against economic insecurity and loss of social rights that the welfare state, at least in theory, arose to provide. For all practical purposes, Abramowitz was a voice in the wilderness, and the siege of public assistance continued under the George H.W. administration. Through increased use of state waivers, which doubled from 5 to 10 between 1988 and 1990 to about 20 by 1993, the G.H.W. Bush administration set the stage for opening the floodgates of welfare reform, increasing the scope, diversity, and complexity of related efforts. Several shortfalls of the Family Support Act were becoming increasingly clear. The AFDC participation rate in jobs was only 11%, due in large part to limited federal funds and inefficient drawdowns by states. The voluntary, self-selective nature of jobs in many states meant that the requirement to reach out to high-risk groups of young parents, long-term welfare recipients, and families about to age out or lose AFDC eligibility as their children turn 18 years of age was not met. About half the jobs participants chose some form of education to meet work-related requirements, while workfare or community work experience drew only 3% of participants. The 20-hour rule presented a problem in the U.S. South, where a monthly benefit of $210 translated into 10 hours of work a week, half of what jobs required. Many welfare enrollees in low-benefit states did not count as jobs participants, with many states simply dropping welfare as a result. Other problems with FSA were noted. Less than 10% of those who got jobs and left AFDC roles in 1991 received daycare services, even though FSA guaranteed them. About 46,000 of an estimated 280,000 children received transitional care in September 1991. Such FSA shortcomings set the stage for what became the major transformation of the U.S. welfare system during the Clinton administration, the subject of our next lecture. This lecture provides an overview of welfare reform efforts during the presidential administration of Bill Clinton. I discussed the politics associated with welfare reform and the enactment of the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, which replaced the Entitlement Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC program, with a time-limited block grant temporary assistance for needy families program known as TANF, T-A-N-F. I highlight several major provisions of Title I of the 1996 Act: creation of TANF, work requirements, and two other provisions influenced by the Christian right regarding out-of-wedlock births and abortions, and charitable choice. Finally, I note 4 of 8 other provisions that had little to do with Title I per se, but which affected child support enforcement, illegal immigrants, child care, among other factors affecting low-income families. I'll begin with how the issue of welfare reform was phrased for public consumption and the use of waivers by the Clinton administration. In his presidential campaign manifesto, Putting People First, Clinton framed the needs of poor persons primarily in economic terms. But as president, he recast the issue as one of a spiritual redemptive uplift, which his ending welfare as we know it rhetoric reaffirmed. For example, at a convocation of Memphis churchgoers, President Clinton extolled work's virtues. I do not believe we can repair the basic fabric of society until people willing to work have work. Work organizes life. It gives structure and discipline to life. It gives meaning and self-esteem to people who are parents. It gives a role model to children. For the first 2 years of the Clinton administration, which began on January 20th, 1993, welfare reform took a back seat to what eventually became an unsuccessful healthcare reform effort. During that time, his administration issued waivers, authorizing states to create pilot programs that, for low-income parents, in effect, tied cash receipt to work labor force participation. In 1995, an estimated 75% of all AFDC participants in the U.S. were involved in waiver-authorized pilot programs. Waivers were granted for 18 demonstration projects, with substantial within and between state variation. California, Georgia, Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Vermont were operating statewide programs. Connecticut, Florida, Illinois, Virginia, and Wyoming had some provisions that were statewide. Wisconsin had a statewide program and one confined to several counties. Arkansas, Colorado, Hawaii, Oklahoma, and Oregon had programs that operated less than statewide. In general, the existence of waivers, even more than findings from the demonstration projects, played an important role in redefining welfare as a transitional program rather than as an entitlement. The increasing number of such demonstration projects placed the notion of abolishing welfare entitlement in the public eye, partly through widespread media coverage in the nightly news and numerous newspaper articles. Under Clinton, waivers portended a fundamentally restructured public assistance through work requirements. In addition to work requirements, demonstration projects also provided opportunities to experiment with other aspects of welfare provision. Wisconsin's Work Not Welfare program, for example, contained a time limit on benefits. Recipients could receive assistance only 24 months, and no cash assistance was available for 36 months after the 24-month time limit was reached. The Wisconsin program was a 2-county quasi-experimental program, having a matched comparison group in lieu of a randomly assigned control group. It served about 1,000 participants over its lifespan. Despite these design and size limitations, Wisconsin's Work Not Welfare program was symbolically important because it defined the term welfare term limit and had a provision calling for the elimination of AFDC in 1999. President Clinton introduced the Work and Responsibility Act of 1994 during the second session of the 103rd Congress on June 21st. In the transmittal message, President Clinton signaled his acceptance of the idea that able-bodied parents of young children without labor force attachment were somehow deprived of dignity in need of restoration. It is time to end welfare as we know it and replace it with a system that is based on work and responsibility, a system that will help people help themselves. This legislation rewards work over welfare. It signals that people should not have children until they are ready to support them, and that parents, both parents, who bring children into the world must take responsibility for supporting them. It gives people access to the skills they need and expects them to work in return. Most important, it will give people back the dignity that comes from work and independence. The original Clinton plan called for all recipients to begin training or job search immediately upon beginning workfare. It set a 2-year time limit of cash aid, but certain activities extended the limit, such as part-time work if one had preschool children or full-time work if children were under the age of 6. After 2 years, recipients would be required to work, preferably in an unsubsidized job. If such jobs are unavailable, a subsidized job would be created. States were given flexibility, reflecting the administration's approval of waivers meant to encourage experimentation. But welfare remained an entitlement. That is, all who qualified were guaranteed cash assistance. In the Democratic-controlled 104th Congress, President Clinton vetoed the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act of 1995, claiming, among other things, that it contained insufficient supports to enable welfare mothers to enter, prepare for, or find jobs. I now focus on how the tide turned in favor of ending the open-ended entitlement of public assistance to low-income families. The Clinton administration bill died in 1996 when Republicans took control of Congress for the first time since 1953. Republicans came to Congress armed with their Contract with America, initially presented by Republican House candidates led by Newt Gingrich of Georgia and Dick Armory of Texas on September 27, 1994. Many of the ideas and proposals expressed in the Contract with America had been previously developed by Republicans, over the years working together in task forces and other quasi-legislative groups in cooperation with lobbying organizations outside Congress, such as the Republican Governors Association, the think tank Heritage Foundation, and Empower America, another conservative think tank founded in 1993 by William Bennett, the U.S. Department of Education Secretary in the Reagan administration, and drug czar in the G.H.W. Bush administration. The 10 legislative goals enumerated in the contract focused on cutting taxes, balancing the federal budget, and reducing the federal role in social welfare provision. Regarding welfare reform, the contract committed House Republicans to drastically change the structure of AFDC payments by promising to introduce within the first 100 days of a Republican Congress a bill they dubbed the Personal Responsibility Act, under which mothers under 18 would no longer receive AFDC payments for children born out of wedlock, and allowed states to prohibit mothers 18, 19, or 20 years of age from receiving AFDC payments and household benefits. Among other things, House Republicans promised to permit states to drop families from receiving AFDC benefits after receiving welfare for 2 years if at least 1 year was spent in a work program. The most dramatic change was mandating states to drop families from the program after they received a total of 5 years of AFDC benefits, a provision which in effect would end the entitlement nature of AFDC and a promise Congress eventually fulfilled in 1996. I focus now on the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, namely Title I, that in effect ended the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, or AFDC. President Clinton signed the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996 on August 22nd. This law effectively fulfilled Clinton's campaign promise to end welfare as it was known then, or certainly since 1935, but in a way that neither he nor his administration's key welfare reform architects, including David Ellwood, Mary Jo Bain, Peter Edelman, and Wendell Primus, had anticipated. Rather, many of the provisions were echoed what House Republicans had promised 2 years earlier in their contract with America. The 1996 Act capped federal welfare spending to states and limited federal cash assistance to 5 years maximum, while permitting states to end cash assistance benefits sooner, thereby ending the entitlement aspects of federal cash assistance to poor persons and their families. The 1996 Act encompassed 9 titles that departed markedly from prior law and went beyond the AFDC population. Title I was the heart of the law with 4 main subtitles. Title I created TANF and replaced AFDC. What had been AFDC, Emergency Assistance and Job Programs, was combined into a single capped entitlement to states. In striking contrast to AFDC, which guaranteed benefits to eligible individuals for as long as they were deemed eligible, the 1996 Act made no provisions for individual guarantee of benefits and deemed ineligible for federally funded cash assistance families who had received such cash assistance for 5 cumulative years or less at state option. Title I also required states to demonstrate that they will require families to work after 2 years on assistance and set work participation rates for single-parent families at 25% of fiscal year 1997, increasing to 50% by fiscal year 2000, and for 2-parent families from 75% to 90% by fiscal year 1999. Work hours were also specified for single-parent and 2-parent families, 20 and 35 hours per week, respectively, with some exceptions for single parents with children under 6 who could not find childcare. Work activities included unsubsidized or subsidized employment, on-the-job training, OJT, work experience, community service, up to 12 months of vocational training, or providing child care services to individuals who are participating in community service. Up to 6 weeks of job search were also permitted, although states' unemployment rates 50% or above the national average were permitted up to 12 weeks. No more than 20% of the caseload was permitted to count vocational training toward meeting the work requirement. Unmarried minor parents were required to live with an adult or in an adult supervised setting and participate in educational and training activities to receive federal assistance. Bonuses were also provided to states which exceeded work requirement provisions. Title I also included bonuses to states demonstrating decreased out-of-wedlock births and abortions from a prior 2-year period. Title I required states and local governments to include faith-based organizations when purchasing services from non-governmental sources. This charitable choice provision signified a new relationship or partnership between religious organizations and public welfare. Local church groups would no longer be denied access to government funds simply because of their association with religious activities. I will end this lecture briefly mentioning 4 of the 8 remaining titles that are tangentially related to the Title I TANF provisions in the 1996 Act. The remaining 8 provisions of the 1996 Act had little or no impact on TANF provisions of Title I, though affecting low-income families. For purposes here, I highlight 4 of the 8. Title II mandated states to operate a Child Support Enforcement Program, CSE, meeting federal requirements to be eligible for TANF. Recipients were required to sign rights to child support and cooperate with paternity establishment efforts, penalizing those who refused by reducing their cash assistance by at least 25%. Title IV provided a separate allocation specifically for childcare, but eliminated the child care guarantee for working AFDC recipients, those participating in jobs or state-approved training and education programs, as well as for up to 1 year during the transition off welfare due to employment. Single parents with children under 6 who could not find childcare were exempt from engaging in work activities. Title VIII denied food stamps to most legal immigrants until citizenship. Also, it established a new work requirement under which non-exempt 18 to 15-year-olds with no dependent children's responsibility were ineligible to receive food stamps after 3 months, within a 36-month period, unless they were working or participating in a workfare, work or employment and training program. Title IX contains several miscellaneous provisions. One establishing spending levels for the social services block grant. Another allowing states to perform drug tests on recipients and to sanction those testing positive. And the third, providing funds for states to provide abstinence education with the option of targeting the fund to high-risk groups, that is, most likely to bear children out of wedlock. The 1996 legislation had an original expiration date of October 1, 2002, though with some political haggling has been renewed with modest changes several times since then. Caseloads plummeted, due in part to an improved economy and to deliberate administrative efforts by states to move current and potential recipients into the labor market and benefit from the Earned Income Tax Credit, the subject of our next lecture. The Earned Income Tax Credit was enacted in 1975 as part of the Tax Reduction Act during the Ford administration and became permanent under the Carter administration as part of the Revenue Act of 1978. EITC matured as an anti-poverty strategy during the Reagan administration as part of the Tax Reform Act of 1986, when Congress raised the maximum benefit, which had fallen by 35% in real terms, to the 1975 level, increased the phase-out level to near the 1975 level, and most importantly, guaranteed the future integrity of the Earned Income Tax Credit by indexing it for inflation. As others have noted, the Earned Income Tax Credit was preferred to raising the minimum wage as an anti-poverty strategy, in part because it better targeted low-income households rather than low-wage earning students or teenagers, and it accounted for family size. From 1975 through 1987, the number of EITC claimants ranged between 6,000 and 9,000. In 1988, more than 11,000 individuals claimed the credit. By 2006, more than 23 million returns were filed claiming the credit, representing nearly 16.7% of all tax filers filed for that year, and $44.4 billion in revenue lost to the U.S. Treasury. By contrast, for fiscal year 2006, net federal expenditures for TANF amounted to $13.6 billion, less than one-third of revenue lost in calendar 2006 due to earned income tax credit. Total EITC claimants climbed to 25 million in 2020, with total costs, that is, lost revenues, increasing to nearly $60 billion. The Earned Income Tax Credit is a refundable tax credit available to eligible workers earning relatively low wages. Because the credit is refundable, an EITC recipient need not owe taxes to receive the benefit. Eligibility for and the amount of the EITC are based on a variety of factors, including residence and taxpayer ID requirements, the presence of qualifying children, age requirements for childless recipients, and the recipient's investment income and earned income. Taxpayers with income above certain thresholds, these thresholds are based on marital status and number of qualifying children, are ineligible for the credit. The EITC varies based on a recipient's earned income. Specifically, the EITC phases in as a percentage of earned income, the credit rate, until the credit amount reaches its maximum level. In the income phase range, the EITC acts as a wage subsidy. As the family earns more, the transfer increases up to a maximum rate of 40%, which is sufficiently high to offset disincentive effects associated with a 15% Social Security tax rate and a 24% food stamp reduction rate. The EITC then remains at its maximum level over a subsequent range of earned income between the earned income amount and the phase-out threshold. That is, the maximum credit range, the transfer remains constant regardless of earnings. Finally, the credit gradually decreases to zero at a fixed rate, the phase-out rate, for each additional dollar of adjusted gross income, or earned income, whichever is greater, above the phase-out amount threshold. In the phase-out range, the earned income tax credit acts like a negative income tax. As family earns more, the transfer is reduced. While the phase-in range provides a work incentive, the maximum and phase-out ranges have work disincentives for some families. The specific values of these EITC parameters, credit rate, earned income amount, vary depending on several factors, including the number of qualifying children a taxpayer has and the taxpayer's marital status, as this slide shows. For 2020, the maximum EITC for a taxpayer without children is $538 per year. In contrast, the 2020 maximum EITC for a taxpayer with one child is $3,584 per year. For two children, $5,920 per year, and for three or more children, $6,660 per year. The EITC is provided to individuals and families once a year in a lump sum payment after individuals and families file their federal income tax returns. Like all tax credits, the EITC can reduce income tax liability. And because the EITC is a refundable tax credit, if a taxpayer's EITC is greater than what they owe in income taxes, they can receive the difference, the portion of the credit that remains after offsetting any income tax liability as part of their annual tax refund. The amount of the credit that remains after offsetting any income tax liability is often referred to as the refundable portion of the earned income tax, whereas the amount that reduces income tax liability is referred to as the non-refundable portion of the credit. A taxpayer who has no income tax liability will receive all the income tax or all the EITC as the refundable portion of the credit. I will now distinguish the EITC from other means-tested programs designed for low-income individuals and families, and from other tax expenditure programs. As earnings requirement differentiates the EITC from other programs benefiting low-income persons and their families in the U.S. Further, the EITC is the only refundable tax credit among the major means-tested programs in the U.S. In addition to TANF, other means-tested programs include food stamps, since October 1, 2008, known as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, Medicaid, Supplemental Security Income, SSI, subsidized childcare, and housing vouchers. A refundable tax credit means that if the amount of the credit exceeds the taxpayer's federal income tax liability, the excess is payable to the taxpayer as a direct transfer payment. Also, unlike means-tested programs such as food stamps, there is no asset or wealth test associated with the earned income tax credit. I will now compare the earned income tax credit to other tax expenditure programs. As a tax expenditure, the EITC functions like the deduction of home mortgage interest and the exclusion of employer pension program contributions from income, two of the largest in terms of lost revenue and best known tax expenditures, neither of which, however, is means tested. As this slide shows, in fiscal year 2021, EITC is among the top 7 largest tax expenditure programs, even exceeding 10th ranked deductions for charitable contributions, as estimated by the Congressional Joint Commission on Taxation and the White House Office of Management and Budget. Both the home mortgage interest and the employer pension program preceded New Deal legislation by several decades, with HMI incorporated into authorization of the federal income tax in 1913, and the EPP evolving from administrative rulings of the Treasury Department from 1914 and cemented in the Tax Revenue Act of 1926. Like HMI and EPP, the Earned Income Tax Credit Program forms part of what some refer to as the hidden welfare state under the jurisdiction of the Department of the Treasury and Internal Revenue Service. Hidden need not mean unknown, as many homeowners are fully aware and partake of HMI. Tax expenditures such as HMI and EPP are not construed in the public mind as part of the U.S. welfare state. Nevertheless, people may perceive a reduction in taxes for engaging in specified activities differently from an identical direct grant. Tax reductions are equated with keeping their own money, whereas an identical program that taxes them and gives the money back through programs or services may be perceived as a subsidy. I will end this lecture with a brief discussion of some pros and cons of using tax expenditures to fund public programs for low-income individuals and families rather than direct expenditures. The EITC and other tax expenditure programs, such as corporate health benefits, are often contrasted with more visible direct expenditure programs such as TANF and Social Security. At issue is whether the advantages of direct expenditure standalone programs outweigh those of tax expenditure programs, especially for low-income individuals and families. For example, TANF, which, despite the bureaucratic indignities of welfare offices, has the advantages of testing for eligibility and for providing benefits as needed over short periods of time. EITC, despite less responsiveness to need due to reliance on an annual accounting period and potential inaccuracy in targeting due to the limited extent of audits, is simpler to administer given the infrastructure of the tax system. As a wage supplement, the EITC is not designed to be, nor can it be, responsive to those in dire need. Nor is it designed to be temporary, since low-wage workers may remain that way for long stretches of time. Although the EITC increases the supply of low-waged jobs, a policy outcome preferable to discouraging job creation, it nonetheless suppresses creation of higher wage jobs, since it lowers and shifts the cost of maintaining an anti-poverty wage from employers to taxpayers. In general, however, tax expenditure programs such as the Earned Income Tax Credit are financed out of general revenue rather than contributory payroll taxes and dedicated trust funds, as is the case with Social Security. They are structured as open-ended entitlements, that is, no annual ceiling is placed on spending. Everyone who meets eligibility requirements is entitled to benefits. To the extent tax expenditures are targeted, they benefit affluent more than poor persons, namely those who can afford to own homes or those whose employers provide such benefits as retirement plans and health insurance. The EITC is a major tax expenditure exception in that it specifically targets low-income working persons, albeit primarily through, not exclusively, those with children. Despite the absence of payroll taxes and trust funds, there is no stigma attached to EITC benefits, which is the case for tax expenditures in general. Although policymakers and pundits have intermittently raised public ire about corporate welfare, they have not warned of tax deduction dependency. I now turn to challenges ahead. There were no major welfare reform measures since enactment of the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act of 1996. Instead, measures affecting low-income individuals and families were folded into more comprehensive legislation responding to the financial crisis of 2007 to 9 and the coronavirus pandemic that officially began in 2019, hence its name, COVID-19. Labor force participation had displaced income maintenance as the consensual goal of public policy designed to benefit low-income individuals and families for the first 2 decades of the 21st century, at least until the COVID-19 pandemic. For purposes here, I am going to bypass universal strategies linking education and workforce development as embedded in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, the main legislative initiative of the Obama administration to get the U.S. economy out of the recession. I am also going to bypass other labor market policies affecting low-income individuals and families, such as minimum wage legislation and wage subsidies for employers. Instead, I want to discuss 2 historically rejected policy options benefiting low-income families, namely family allowances and guaranteed income, an idea that resurfaced during the Democratic Party's presidential primary in 2020, and the distribution of cash payments as a federal response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I begin with the need for family allowances. The U.S. has no explicit family policy, nor does it have a coherent set of social policies that target children, and by extension, adult child caregivers of elderly parents and their families. Instead, the U.S. has several policies that have consequences for children, adult child caregivers of the elderly in need of care, and their families, and these may be considered implicit family policies. TANF and the Earned Income Tax Credit are exemplary of social policies and programs having consequences for children and elderly parents, needing to rely on their adult children for care. The need for and policy responses to date for child care and elder care underscore the rationale for considering family allowances as a viable policy option. Costs related to child care, for example, have consistently been found to affect the employment decisions of low-earning and single mothers. Decreases in such costs are associated with increases in material or maternal employment. To underscore the importance of childcare, the portended and increasingly whittled $3.5 billion social policy bill being pushed by President Joseph Biden and many congressional Democrats in 2001 would, among other things, cap families' child care expenditures at 7% of parents' income, offer large subsidies to child care centers, and requires centers to raise wages in hopes of improving teacher quality. A version before the House would cost $250 billion over a decade and raise annual spending 5-fold or more within a few years. About 10 million children a month under the age of 6 would receive the subsidy. An additional $200 billion would be allocated for universal pre-kindergarten. Such an extension of the social safety net for low-income and more moderate-income families would build on several legislative precedents, including the Child Care Development Block Grant, which Congress created as part of the budget reconciliation process in 1990, and which provided federal funds for child care services for children from low-income families. With creation of TANF in 1996, Congress established the Child Care and Development Fund, which was distributed to states to operate child care subsidy programs. Eligibility for child care services was set at a maximum of 85% of a state's median family income, and states had the option of not providing any funds for such services regardless of eligibility. Further, children had to be under 13 years of age, be living with parents who were either working or in school or in need of protective services. States had to use at least 70% of their block grant funds for child care services for families that sought independence from TANF through work or for families that were at risk of becoming dependent on public assistance. With approximately 1.3 million young children younger than 13 years of age receiving the subsidy every month, This is the largest source of funding for childcare in the U.S. I end this lecture and the course discussing the elusive quest for a guaranteed income and the distribution of cash payments as a federal response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Basic income guarantee, or universal grant schemes, have historical roots in Europe as well as in the U.S., with more contemporary initiatives gaining attention in the 1960s and an international movement taking hold in the late 1980s and throughout the 1990s. Several localized pilot programs and studies during the first 2 decades of the 21st century. To date, only 2 national governments, Brazil and Mongolia, have promised their respective citizens income, but neither country has allocated or distributed any money. A related idea was also proposed as a possibility for Iraq, but also to no avail. As noted in previous lectures, the U.S. nearly adopted the Nixon administration's Family Assistance Plan in the late 60s and early 70s, setting an income floor beneath low-wage workers, as well as those deemed outside the labor force with limited or no income. Alternatively, in 1972, presidential contender Senator George McGovern proposed a demogrant as part of the Democratic Party platform, a $1,000 check from the federal government to every citizen in the U.S. Basically, this went nowhere. To no avail, policy analyst Irv Garfinkel advocated for demogrants as part of a Social Security reform throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. Economist Robert Haveman proposed a universal refundable tax credit demogrant set as 1/2 to 2/3 of the poverty line to assist those in the bottom 1/5 of the income distribution. The failure to adopt FAP and related income guarantee initiatives throughout the 1980s have been attributed to 1. The unpopularity of collapsing the cultural distinction between unworthy, non-working poor, and able-bodied working poor. 2. The variety of meanings associated with the idea of guaranteed annual income. And 3. The byproducts of ongoing debates themselves, namely the ascendancy of political conservative initiatives such as welfare-to-work rhetoric and programs. By nearly a 2-to-1 margin in 1976, voters in Alaska approved an amendment to the state's constitution, creating the Alaska Permanent Fund, a state-run investment savings account that pays equal annual dividends to every Alaskan citizen. The fund was established as a public trust for oil revenues from drilling on the state's North Slope to protect a portion of the state's revenue, about 21%, to benefit all generations of Alaskans. The logic behind establishing the dividend was to give citizens a stake in the fund and make it more difficult for state legislators to spend fund earnings. Distributions were tied to length of residence and voter registration. Dividend distribution to citizens differentiated use of the fund's earnings from other types of public trusts, from natural resource revenues, such as the Alberta Heritage Saving Trust Fund, whose earnings are invested in the provincial economic development and hence subject to political pressures regarding investment decisions for those purposes. In 2021, the fund was worth about $81 billion. Annual dividends have been paid out since 1982, ranging from a high of $2,600 in 2020 in 2000 to a low of $529 in 1984, with the median about $1,450 between 1982 and 2020. The Coronavirus Aid, Relief and Economic Security Act, or the CARES Act, was signed into law by President Trump on March 27, 2020. Includes direct payments to individuals, referred to in the law as the 2020 recovery rebates. The Internal Revenue Service refers to the payments issued in 2020 as economic impact payments, whereas some media reports call them stimulus payments. The 2020 recovery rebates equal $1,200 per eligible individual, $2,400 for married tax filers filing a joint tax return, and $500 per eligible child. These amounts phase down for higher income taxpayers. The total tax credit phases out at a rate of 5% of adjustable gross income above $75,000, $112,500 per head of household for filers, and $150,000 for married joint returns. During the presidential primary in 2020, while COVID-19 still ravaged the country, Democratic primary candidate Andrew Yang and his ardent Yang Gang advocates gave the prospect of a guaranteed income of $2,000 cash a national platform. Though Yang dropped out of the presidential contention, the idea of direct cash assistance to keep the economy going, that is, enabling individuals and families to retain a level of consumption close to pre-pandemic levels, resonated, at least in the context of COVID-19 pandemic on a time-limited basis. The American Rescue Act of 2021, signed by President Joe Biden on March 11th, includes direct payments, recovery rebates to families. The rebate value is set at $1,400 per person, including dependents, phasing out over an income range of $75,000 to $80,000 for single filers, and up to $150,000 to $160,000 for married filers. The Rescue Plan Act of 2021 projects that this provision would cost $416 billion, with 90% of families receiving the payment. This section revises and increases the child tax credit in 2021 and makes the credit refundable. The amount of the credit increased to $3,000 for each child under 17 and $3,600 for children under the age of 6 years. The amount of the credit is reduced based on adjusted gross income of the tax filer. This section revises the earned income tax credit in 2021 for individuals with no qualifying children, and it lowers the minimum age for eligibility for the credit for students and foster youth. Though most cash assistance is meant to expire by the end of 2021, congressional Democrats and the Biden administration are seeking, among other things, permanent extension of the child tax credit, earned income tax credits, and paid family leave benefits. Guaranteed income per se is not part of the social safety net package, though basic income pilot programs may offer some promise regarding expansion of the child tax credit. One such program reported in the New Republic is the Magnolia Mothers Trust, a guaranteed income pilot that gives low-income Black mothers $1,000 per month for a year, no strings attached. The Magnolia Mothers Trust is the longest-running basic income experiment since the Nixon era and is among the first on a citywide level, namely Jackson, Mississippi. Unlike other programs in Stockton, California, or Newark, New Jersey, which select from a wider pool, the Magnolia Mothers Trust targets only Black mothers, acting in some ways like a child allowance. Most other developed countries have implemented a child allowance, but the United States has been an outlier, at least until pandemic politics offered an opportunity in 2021. The expectation is that the expanded child tax credit would cut child poverty in half. I'll end this course with a note that much of the related debates focus on whether such benefits should target mostly needy individuals and families, or extend such benefits into the middle class, if not make them universal to all parents with young children. The merits of selective versus universal benefits has its own history of social welfare benefits in the U.S., at least since the Social Security Act of 1935. Anyone interested in a further elaboration of selective versus universal benefits in social welfare provisioning in the U.S. are encouraged to view the academia.edu course video Policy Analysis for Social Justice Advocates. I hope you have benefited from this course. Any questions, comments, concerns, please contact me at Caputo, C-A-P-U-T-O, @yu.edu. Ciao for now.